Meanwhile, the chip war is intensifying. It's the US versus China. Today, China fired a salvo, its first major strike, really. China has banned an American company, a memory chip giant called Micron Technology. On what grounds? China says it poses a national security risk, so it has banned the chips from key infrastructure projects. And what is America's response? It says China's actions and accusations have no basis in fact, but observers see it for what it is. It's a tit-for-tat move from Beijing. Remember, Washington has been trying to curtail China's computer chip industry for a while now. The campaign is being led by US President Joe Biden. He's been urging allies to counter China's chip dominance, and now China has fired back. What does it mean for the company, for the chip industry, and for the world? Our next report explains.
The US-China chip war. It's one of the battlefields where the world's two biggest economies are trading blows. The fight is over advanced computer chips and the ability to make and use them. Over the past year, Washington has been on the attack. It blocked China's access to chip-making equipment and urged allies like Japan and South Korea to restrict chip sales. Overall, the US has been tightening the screws. But yesterday, China struck back. It announced a ban on US giant Micron Technology. Micron's products cannot be used for key infrastructure in China. And what constitutes key infrastructure? Whatever Beijing wants. China has loose definitions which help it exploit situations like this. But observers say that Micron chips will be banned in sectors ranging from telecoms to transport and finance. How is China justifying this ban? By saying that Micron failed its network security review and that Micron's products are a threat to China's national security.
I want to stress that the relevant review is to prevent cybersecurity issues of the product from endangering the security of key national information infrastructure. It is a necessary measure to protect national security.
The review was conducted by the Cyberspace Administration of China, or CAC. It says it has come to the conclusion that Micron products should be banned. On what grounds? Which products? The CAC hasn't given any details yet. Most observers think this move is more about politics than security. It was a shot fired at the US. Look at the timing. The announcement was made yesterday while the G7 summit was taking place in nearby Japan. It came when US President Joe Biden said the G7 nations had agreed to look at their relationships with China. The G7 nations want to counter what they call China's economic coercion. They want to de-risk and diversify their ties with Beijing. So it seems that China hit back with the Micron ban. Micron says it looks forward to continuing to engage in discussions with Chinese authorities. What choice does it have? Remember, China is a lucrative market. Last year, about 10% of Micron's $30 billion revenue came from mainland China. It's about 16% if you include Hong Kong. But there may be a silver lining. Micron produces chips that go into smartphones and computers. It has chips for infrastructure too, but that's a smaller part of Micron's business. Most of Micron's customers in China were also foreign firms, companies that manufactured their products in China. Technically, they haven't been barred from buying Micron products, so it isn't clear how much Micron will suffer due to China's ban. But despite the possibly weak impact, Beijing's move is still seen as an escalation, a return of fire in the chip war. The question is, how will the US respond to the latest salvo? We'll keep you updated.
Now let's talk about China. This year was supposed to be about their economic recovery. Instead, the Communist Party is dealing with a new problem, a new debt crisis. And the amount is staggering. $23 trillion. These are loans owed by the Chinese government. And a large chunk of this debt is accounted for, like what the Chinese government has borrowed by issuing bonds to the general public. This is accounted for, and this is not the problematic part. What's causing an alarm is the hidden debt in China. Now, what's hidden debt? These are loans taken by local governments. They're off the books. They're hidden, so it's hard to say how big these loans are. The estimates vary depending on who you ask, but no matter who you ask, they'll all tell you one thing. This is serious. Investment bank Goldman Sachs has one estimate. It says China's local governments owe $8.5 trillion. The The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, has a different number. Their figure is $10 trillion. That's more than 40% of the initial estimate and over 80% of China's GDP. That's right. According to one estimate, China's GDP today stands at a little over $12 trillion, and the local government debt is at $10 trillion. These are the IMF's numbers. Whichever figure you choose to believe, it doesn't change a fundamental problem. Loans like these are unsustainable. They could push Chinese provinces towards bankruptcy. In fact, in some places, it's already happening. Hegang is a remote coal town in northeastern China. It is near China's border with Russia. Close to 1 million people live here. They're all suffering a financial crisis. According to one report, locals in Hegang do not have indoor heating. Taxi drivers are being slapped with more fines. Public school teachers fear job cuts. Street cleaners haven't got their salaries in 2 months. And these are all signs of financial distress. Reports say there's a cash crunch. And this story is not unique to this town of Hegang. It's playing out in the Guizhou region too. They're facing a debt crisis. Do you know how much money they owe? 2.6 trillion yuan. That's $380 billion, or 130% of Guizhou's GDP. How did this happen? How did a province borrow so much money without any checks and balances? Like I said, it was done off the books. In China, you have something called LGFVs. That's local government financing vehicles, LGFVs. And what are these? These are basically private companies. These are companies created by local officials just to borrow money. This is a way to bypass the official channels. And it serves two purposes. One, the debt doesn't show up on the official balance sheets. And two, there is no limit on how much money you can borrow. So these local governments keep raising more cash. And now that debt pile is crushing them. It's hard to say how many provinces are in distress, but reports mention some very frequently, like Guizhou, Henan, Heilongjiang, Hubei, and Guangdong. All these provinces are in debt distress. Either their provincial governments have loans to pay, or specific cities there are under strain. Either way, it's bad news for Xi Jinping. Bankrupt provinces is the last thing the Chinese president needs. Earlier this year, he asked officials to rein in debt. In fact, let me quote from a speech that was published in a Chinese journal. This is what he said: "It's necessary to consolidate the responsibility of provincial level governments to prevent and resolve hidden debts, increase efforts to dispose of outstanding hidden debts, optimize the maturity structure of debts, reduce the interest burden, steadily promote the unified supervision of local government hidden debt and on-the-books debt, and resolutely curb the increase of hidden debt." These are Xi Jinping's words. He wants to double income levels in China by 2035, but these hidden debts will come in the way. Any debt distress poses a risk for Xi Jinping because it will impact the middle class. It could widen the gap between the rich and the poor, and that in turn would threaten social stability and pose a challenge to the rule of the Communist Party. Can China control this crisis before it blows in its face? Well, knowing them, they'll first try to control the narrative and scrub off such reports. Finally, here's something to wrap your Monday with. Not very cheerful, I'm afraid, but definitely worth your time and attention. I'll begin with a question. What is the leading cause of death in our world? Not guns or tanks, not wars or famines. It's heart disease. It killed over 20 million people in 2021. And this is the global data. If you look country-wise, some are worse off than the others. Like Russia. Here, heart disease accounted for 46% of the deaths. In India, the figure was 28%. In the US, 20%. But overall, every country has ailing hearts, and their numbers are going up. We're talking about a 60% jump in the last 3 decades. If that sounds bad, wait for what's coming next. 80% of all cases of cardiovascular disease are preventable. So why aren't we doing something about it? Our next report tells you. This is the human heart. It is our most important muscle, also the strongest one. It is only the size of our fist, but it pumps about 5 liters of blood through our system every minute. That's over 7,000 liters per day. Quite the workload, right? That's why the heart takes a beating over its lifetime. And if we don't treat it right, or if it suffers from a pre-existing problem, it can grow even weaker. Over time, the heart's functions become compromised, and this is known as cardiovascular disease. It is the leading cause of deaths in the world. In 2021, more than 20 million people worldwide died due to heart disease. In 1990, the number was a little over 12 million. That's an increase of 60% globally within a span of about 3 decades. So this is clearly a global problem, but the numbers are different for different parts of the world. For example, Russia is one of the worst hit. 46% of its deaths are due to heart diseases. In Europe, the number is a little over 36%. In Southeast Asia, heart disease kills 4 million people every year. That's nearly 1/3 of all their deaths. What about India? Here, heart disease accounts for more than 28% of all deaths. And in the US, 1 out of every 5 people die due to cardiovascular problems. In the next 30 odd years, these cases could jump by 30%. And the increase in deaths by heart problems is a growing fear globally. The question is why? Cardiovascular diseases are more common among adults than in younger people. And the world is aging. By 2050, 1 in 6 people in the world will be over 65 years of age. That's nearly double the number of aged people today. So heart diseases have more people to prey on. Also think about the conditions behind the risk of heart disease, like high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity. All of these are on the rise. Worldwide, obesity has nearly tripled since 1975 and diabetes has quadrupled. Also, let's not forget smoking. It increases the risk of heart disease by about 4 times and over 22% of the population uses tobacco. All of these conditions are often developed at a younger age. So as people get older, the risks of heart disease increase. But guess what? 80% of all cardiovascular diseases are preventable only if we do our part. Like exercising, eating healthy and not smoking, simple things can do wonders for our body. Our governments can do their part too. The World Health Organization says they should spend at least 5% of their GDP to bring down the cardiovascular death rates. But countries often don't hit the mark. The fact is, investing in healthcare saves lives. The evidence is indisputable. So it's time the world takes better care of its hearts. In Italy, the headlines are all about fire and floods. First, they suffered the worst flooding in 100 years. Now they're dealing with a volcanic eruption. We're talking about Mount Etna. It is Europe's most active volcano and it has erupted. It is spewing volcanic ash in the southern island of Sicily. Meanwhile, at the other end of the country, at least 14 people have died due to flash floods. More than 36,000 people have been evacuated from the northern regions of Italy. It's so bad that Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had to cut short her visit to Japan. She was there for the G7 summit. She had to rush back home to deal with the situation. And she says that her country may need the help of the European Union to rebuild. Here's a report.
This is Mount Etna, the most active volcano in Europe. It erupted on Sunday. Plumes of volcanic ash flew out of Mount Etna's crater. The volcano is located in the island of Sicily, near coastal cities in the east. The popular tourist destination, Catania, is being engulfed in falling ash. It's covered in a layer of soot and grime. Its airport had to be shut. Flights to and from Catania have been suspended. But it's not something unusual for the area.
This morning, it all started around 8 o'clock when there were the first roars of the volcano, after which around 11:40, lapilli started to fall, which you can see here in my hands. They are long and 3 to 4 centimeters thick, but fortunately, they are light because they are slag. Etna is making itself felt again, as usual.
Mount Etna erupts quite regularly, sometimes for weeks at a time. Hence, it's described as the most active volcano in Europe. Most eruptions are relatively small. Mount Etna's last major explosion was in 1992. So Italians may not be overly worried about Etna, especially as a different natural disaster in the country's north is making headlines. The worst floods in over 100 years. Italy's Emilia-Romagna region is inundated. Floods have killed at least 14 people. To make matters worse, the Emilia-Romagna region is an agricultural bastion in Italy.
We have never been in a situation like this. Never. The problem is that now we have to see how these plants there, with all that stuff around them, react.
And it isn't just normal floods that are affecting the locals. About 20 rivers have burst their banks in the region. This has led to flash floods and landslides. Authorities say there have been 280 landslides over the last week. Over 36,000 people have been evacuated. Those who chose to stay are dealing with blackouts. That's about 27,000 people. The rains subsided yesterday but left a trail of destruction in their wake. So why is the region facing such devastation? A lot has to do with climate change. Northern Italy is receiving torrential rains after months of drought. That isn't a good thing. When the land gets parched due to drought, it loses its ability to absorb water. That means that when rains do arrive, the water can't seep into the soil. Instead, it gathers on the surface and leads to flooding, which is exactly what's happening in northern Italy. The situation is so serious that Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had to rush back to take stock of the situation. She was in Japan to attend the G7 meeting. She wrapped things up fast and then went to northern Italy.
There are all kinds of emergencies. What is very important for me now is that this comes to an end. And this relates to the issues of bad weather and possible landslides.
Italy's Council of Ministers is meeting tomorrow to figure out how to deal with the situation. So far, they don't know the extent of the damage or how much the recovery will cost. But the government says it will find the funds. It may even dip into the European Union's Solidarity Fund for Natural Disasters. But recovery is just addressing the symptoms. To really tackle the problem, the world needs to work harder to tackle climate change. If not, then devastation like this will become a regular affair.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the Philippines, a massive fire broke out at the Manila Central Post Office. The structure was built in the year 1946. It's considered a national landmark. The fire has done some serious damage to the building. Meanwhile, one of Mexico's most active volcanoes is spewing ash and smoke. This affected flight operations in the region. And a SpaceX rocket ship is heading to the International Space Station. The team going to space includes a female astronaut from Saudi Arabia. She's the first Arab woman astronaut to go to the ISS. And finally, what makes the 22nd of May significant? We're taking you back in history to 1980. On this day, Pac-Man was released, a popular Japanese arcade game. It's been played for over 5 million hours worldwide. The game was created by game designer Toru Iwatani. Fun fact, he got the idea when he removed a slice from a pizza. We leave you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Full power. And liftoff, Falcon 9.
Together we expand what is possible in low Earth orbit. Ad Astra and Godspeed AX2.
Stage 1 throttle down.
Power telemetry nominal. 3 big sequences and a view.
Confirmed. Copy 2 Alpha.
The first stage is into the boost back burn, working its way back.
To help steer the booster down.
Landing leg deploy.
This is the first time that we have performed a land landing on a crew mission.
Thank you so much for all your support getting us here.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.